Chapter 12. Brian Gibson sat on the floor of the kitchen, shaking. His alarm had gone off at 6 a.m, as it always did. He'd got up and showered, as he always did. Then he'd gone downstairs and made breakfast, as he always did. Then he'd collapsed. In between waiting for the toast to pop and the kettle to boil, something inside him had snapped. They'd found Natalie. It was over. Cradling his head in his hands, he gave in to violent sobs. He'd known what was coming the moment he'd seen the detective's number flashing on his phone the previous evening. "I have some terrible news." Emmett Corbin's voice had been flat. Brian had numbly agreed to meet the detective later that night to formally identify his wife's body. He'd been taken to a sterile room where Natalie was lying on a trolley, all but her face covered by a white sheet. "Can I hold her?" "No." "Can I touch her?" "No." Rolling to his knees, Brian wiped his eyes with the back of a hand. How had he let this happen? He'd met Natalie almost 20 years ago, when she'd been a wild, rebellious teenager. They'd shared a deep love of emo punk music, bad haircuts, and body piercings. Their holidays had been spent travelling to music festivals with friends, riding together on overnight buses, and later, when the first of their crew got a licence, squashing together in the back of an old Holden, the extra passengers ducking out of sight whenever a police car was spotted. They'd slept in tents, or sometimes out on mattresses, staring up at the night sky, tripping on pills and booze and happiness. She was the love of his life, and their life had been perfect. A strange rasp escaped from Brian's throat, and he found himself sinking back onto the floor, the cold of the tiles penetrating his skin through his boxer shorts. Theirs had been a reckless, unhindered love. How had things gone so horribly wrong? He coughed, a mixture of snot, tears, and saliva landing on the palm of his left hand, glazing the last of the bruise that was finally healing. Perhaps he'd always had a bad temper, but it had been the arrival of their first child, little Dario, that had set their lives on divergent paths. Brian trembled as he remembered the first year of his son's life. The drastic changes that had come with parenthood had hit them both with a shock so powerful it was like an earthquake shattering every illusion they had ever held about themselves. He'd watched Natalie age before his eyes, her forehead suddenly etched with lines that didn't want to leave, her body changing in strange, and if he was honest, unappealing ways. But worse was the utter implosion of their relationship. Their weekends had no longer involved booze and music and parties, but instead became an endless cycle of washing and dressing and cleaning and stressing. Natalie's sunny, carefree persona completely transformed, as she became stern, tired, and, something Brian would never have imagined, conservative. Suddenly, his funny, outgoing girl listened to talkback radio and spoke earnestly about school zones and childcare expenses. She wanted nothing more than to be at home with her baby and parents, and he wanted nothing more than to escape. Well, maybe now was his chance. Rolling onto all fours, Brian eased himself back up, his knees cracking as he straightened. Moving gingerly, he leant against the kitchen bench and heaped a teaspoon of instant coffee into a mug. As he reboiled the kettle, he squeezed his eyes shut. What should he do? After identifying Natalie's body, he'd been taken back to the police headquarters and interviewed again. It was obvious the detectives didn't trust him. "Are you certain you didn't see your wife at any stage after you left for work on the Friday? Who can confirm your movements that day? Were there any difficulties in your marriage?" Brian sipped his coffee, the caffeine giving him the clarity he was seeking. The police would be watching his every move from now on. It was too late to leave. "Daddy?" His daughter's voice called from the darkness beyond the landing upstairs. "Just a minute, darling." Brian took another sip of coffee. For now, he had to stay and see this out. But once this was all over, his eyes fell on the broom closet in the corner. He would escape for good. Emmett leant against the whiteboard at the front of the room and scrunched his face, unable to contain a long yawn. He'd got 3, maybe 4 hours sleep at best, home just long enough to shower, nap, kiss his son on the head, and be reminded by his wife that Nicholas had his first footy practice match that night. "He's been counting down for ages. You will make it, won't you?" "I'll do my best." Emmett inhaled deeply, letting his heavy eyelids rest for just a moment. All he was ever doing was his best. It was never enough. "Are we waiting for anyone else?" Bryce nudged him with a jolt that almost caused him to topple over. "Can we get going?" "We're all here, but I think Annette was going to bring in the screen so we can play those slides." Emmett stopped as the station secretary appeared right on time, pushing what looked like a large television mounted on wheels. "Here." He helped guide the monstrosity through the doorway. "Okay." The superintendent stepped forward once Annette was gone. "As you all know, late yesterday, a search team, led by Detective Medhurst, discovered a woman's body in the vicinity of the Moonee Ponds Creek. The body was subsequently identified as Natalie Gibson, one of our outstanding missing persons. She was located just 900 metres north of where Rosemary Norman was dumped, and there are worrying similarities between the two deaths. Both women were clothed, with personal identification on them, and both were wrapped in tarpaulins." Bryce paused, turning to the screen and flicking the remote. "From initial examination, both women also suffered superficial lacerations to their bodies." Emmett heard Stephen's sharp inhalation as the gruesome photos appeared. Just like Rosemary, Natalie's torso was marked by 4 deep clinical cuts. "We think the markings are supposed to represent a diamond," Bryce said, "though we have no idea what that means." "What is that?" Stephen held a hand over his mouth as the next image appeared. "That's a close-up of the cutting across the victim's left nipple." Emmett's chest tightened. He'd seen it all yesterday, but that didn't lessen the horror. "Both sets of cuts have been inflicted in a similar way," Bryce continued. "Forensics believe a precise, sharp-edged weapon was used, perhaps a pocket knife or small fishing knife, something like that." "A copycat?" Ted asked. "Unlikely. We deliberately kept Ms. Norman's death out of the media. The only person who would know the extent of her injuries would be her killer." "Is there any known link between the victims?" "Unfortunately, the simple answer is no. But I'll let Detective Corbin elaborate." "Thanks, Superintendent." Emmett stepped forward, noting his boss had shuffled only slightly to the left, not enough for him to take centre stage. "Nothing that we've uncovered gave us any reason to believe that these two cases were connected. And the only similarities we know of now are that both women were in their 30s and both lived in the northwest of Melbourne, around the Flemington area." "And now both are dead," Morton quipped. "Exactly." Emmett looked straight at his overweight colleague. "That's why I'll be getting you and Carter to complete the full background check on each woman. We need to know where she grew up, what schools she attended, what hobbies she participated in, what work she did, and any similarities are to be reported to me immediately. In particular, I want you to speak with teachers at the TAFE where Natalie was studying. We know she attended her aged care placement last Tuesday, but perhaps there's more we haven't uncovered. Like a classmate she was particularly close with. Something like that. And I'll also need you to go back over any outstanding missing persons cases which match a similar profile, to ensure there aren't more victims that we don't know about. Stephen raised a hand. What about the husband, Brian Gibson? We have a warrant to get that security footage from the family deli, and we were planning on doing that first thing this morning. That's fine. You'll have time to do that. Emmett scanned the room as he mentally assigned tasks to each person. Tardio and I will go to Natalie's home with a forensics team, and Medhurst will work with the department's cyber experts to cover the internet histories of both victims. He'll also follow up the security footage that was retrieved from Yarra Trams to plot out Natalie's last known movements. What footage was that? Bianca's gravelly voice called from the side of the room. I wasn't aware there was more. Yesterday afternoon, I managed to find onboard footage of Natalie taking a tram down Mount Alexander Road, near the football club where she dropped her children off. Morton patted his stomach smugly. She was seen getting off at the top of the city, near the Elizabeth Street roundabout. Was she alone? Yes. She got on just after 9 a.m, carrying a large handbag, and didn't talk to anyone. Good work. Bryce nodded in Morton's direction. Emmett noticed Stephen squirm. I've also been making some good headway with locating Rosemary's phone. The young officer's voice was a little shaky. I'd be happy to keep going with that too. Yes, Emmett nodded. Finding the phone has to remain a priority. But I'll get you to liaise with Medhurst since you've both been looking into that. Stephen frowned. We haven't got the preliminary autopsy report for Rosemary Norman yet? Bryce tapped his notes as though to hurry the meeting along. No. Emmett flicked his left wrist, looking at his watch. It was only Thursday morning. The poor woman had been found less than 48 hours ago. I'll chase that up with forensics. I expect it will be with us either today or tomorrow. Good. And I'll be addressing the media later today. Bryce pulled a face that suggested he wasn't looking forward to this. For operational reasons, I would prefer that we kept these cases out of the public spotlight. But with 2 women dead and a killer on the loose, we have a duty to warn the public. The superintendent placed both hands on his belt buckle and widened his stance before looking around the room. We don't know who else may be in danger. The forensics team were already working their way through the Mancini's property when Emmett and Bianca arrived. The carefully manicured garden of number 42 dotted with pale blue jumpsuits. What a pretty home. Bianca's eyes roamed over the neatly marked vegetable patches in the backyard. Yes. Emmett broke off, noticing the frail woman standing shivering by the back door. What was she clutching to her chest? Mrs. Mancini. He stepped over small shoes that were carefully lined up on the doormat. You must be freezing. Please, let's go inside. Natalie's mother didn't respond. She was wearing just a nightgown, her arms visibly shaking in the cold. Emmett placed a steadying hand on the woman's shoulder. You remember me? I'm Detective Corbin, and this is my colleague, Detective Tardio. Francesca looked at Bianca. Her face crumpled. My Natalie, she gasped. I know. Emmett gently guided her through the back doorway, nodding to a team of forensics officers who were moving through the kitchen. I'm so terribly sorry. Do you have a blanket? Or a dressing gown I could get for you? After finding a knitted shawl, Emmett helped Mrs. Mancini to the living room couch, where Bianca was perched. You've put more photos out. His eyes scanned the room. Indeed, the shrine to Natalie had grown. Photos from every school milestone now adorned the shelves, and there were some additions that Emmett guessed must have been taken during her teen years, when she appeared to have been going through some sort of gothic phase. How old was she there? He asked, pointing to a particularly grim-looking young Natalie in heavy makeup.
17,
Francesca whispered, shaking her head as she wiped tears from her face.
Le molto bella.
Bianca reached to a side table and picked up a different photo, surprising everyone with her carefully pronounced Italian.
Si,
Natalie's mother said, before burying her head in the stuffed rabbit she was clutching.
What have you got there?
Bianca asked, gently.
This was Natalie's favorite.
Francesca squeezed the toy tighter into her body.
She always had this with her. When she was a little girl, we could never go anywhere if we didn't have Bunny with us.
What was she like, as a child? For the first time, Francesca's expression lightened. Her eyes sparkled.
She was so funny and cheeky. She loved to show off and try to make people laugh. She was always getting in trouble at school for this or that. But she was a good girl, really. And she adored her father. They were always together, the two of them, playing at the park or digging in the garden.
Natalie's mother stopped and reached for a tissue.
I think this will break Gino.
She blew her nose vigorously.
He won't cope without his princess.
Where is your husband? Emmett asked, suddenly realizing that Gino must be around.
In bed.
Francesca sniffed loudly, her eyes following the figures of 3 forensics officers passing by with several large brown bags.
This was all too much for him.
I understand. The detectives waited as the elderly woman again buried her face in the worn fur of the pink bunny, now damp from tears.
Why are you still crying?
A small voice came from somewhere beyond the dining table. Both detectives turned in surprise. Hello. You must be Dario. Emmett smiled as the young boy approached. The boy scowled. And who's that behind you? Hello, Aria. The children were gorgeous. The boy with deep, molten brown eyes and the young girl with rosy, chubby cheeks. Emmett felt a shooting pain in his chest. Their faces were so scared and unsure. He couldn't imagine Nicholas having to grow up without his mum. Are you staying at home with Grandma today? Dario stared blankly at the detective, but the little girl nodded. Maybe you could show me some of your toys. Bianca stood up and took a firm grip of each child's hand. I bet you've got some great games. After the children had disappeared, Emmett turned back to Francesca. And what about Brian? Was he a good partner for your daughter?
We never liked him.
The elderly woman didn't waste time trying to be diplomatic.
But Natalie was in love. There was nothing we could say that would change her mind.
Were there difficulties in their relationship?
At first it was good, but in the last few years they were always fighting. It was so loud, their arguing. We could hear them from our bedroom window. And Brian would yell and throw things. One time he smashed a window. Gino had to go around and fix it.
Mrs. Mancini. Emmett shuffled forward, the soft leather of the chair he was in squeaking as he did so. Was Brian ever violent towards Natalie or the children? Francesca hesitated.
She showed me a bruise once, around the base of her neck. That was when she was pregnant with Aria.
Was Natalie scared of him? Were you?
Her only worry was for the children, and I knew he couldn't do anything to me as long as Gino was around. He needed us for his job. And for his home.
Did Natalie ever ask Brian to leave?
She wanted to, but the children loved him, even though he was so angry all the time. We talked about that a lot, though.
You and your daughter were very close?
Of course. We told each other everything.
I see. Emmett paused as the clanging of the back door alerted him to his colleague's return. The children are playing outside in the garden. Bianca settled back on the couch beside Natalie's mother. I've made sure the side gate is latched. Emmett shifted in his seat. He remembered his first visit to the Mancinis and the knowing looks he'd seen Francesca and her husband exchange. Mrs. Mancini, we found footage of your daughter taking a tram into the city last Friday, after she dropped the children at the holiday program. Do you have any idea where she might have been going? Was she meeting someone? Francesca fiddled with the bunny in her lap, picking at imaginary bits of fluff.
I don't know. Maybe that study placement?
We've checked that. She'd already attended earlier in the week, and she wasn't due there on the Friday.
Well, then I'm not sure.
It's important you tell us, if you do know, Bianca whispered. No matter what she was doing, she didn't deserve this. Natalie's mother sniffed.
I don't remember.
Can you try? Francesca shifted on the couch, dropping her daughter's old toy and wrapping the shawl around her tighter. For a moment, it looked like she was going to stay silent, but then she dropped her chin to her chest, her lips trembling.
She had an appointment. She went to a clinic.
What sort of clinic? Emmett asked softly, pressing a tissue into the elderly woman's hand. Francesca's face contorted.
She'd found out she was pregnant,
Natalie's mother eventually whispered.
But she didn't want another baby.
She was having a termination? Emmett's mouth turned dry.
Gino and I told her not to go. We would have happily looked after another child, but she insisted. She made us promise we wouldn't tell anyone. She was so ashamed.
The detectives watched as Natalie's mother bowed her head and wept. Did Brian know? Bianca asked.
No.
Francesca wiped her face with both hands before sitting up taller and looking straight ahead.
He had no idea.
The cuts on his hand had turned from red to brown, and the boy found himself staring at his palms in wonder. He'd been practicing using the stones under the prickly tree to toughen himself up, and he was proud to say that he could now etch small shapes into his skin without even flinching. But it was the miraculous way that his body recovered that had him so transfixed. Even one really deep cut, which he'd carved on the soft flesh of his left palm, was now healing, the top layer of skin gently folding over the incision, as though stitching itself back up. It was amazing. Ow! The boy felt a sharp pang on his neck. The sound of muffled sniggering from the back told him that Scott and his mates were at it again, probably flicking rubber bands or something worse, and the boy forced himself not to turn around. Okay. Mr. Stenakis clapped his hands at the front of the room before pointing to the blackboard, where he'd stuck magazine clippings. These are some pictures of families spending time together. Who can tell us what the first picture shows? A playground, a boy at the front yelled out. That's right, Stuart. Here we can see a mum and dad enjoying time with their daughter on the swings at a park. What does this picture show? Playing a game, another child squealed. The teacher continued to point at the photos before stopping and turning to his class. These are all examples of ways families might spend time together. Now I'll get you each to draw a picture of your own family doing something that you enjoy. You might be at the park, or in the pool, or sitting at home, whatever you like. Then we will put all the pages together into one big classroom family book. The teacher clapped his hands together and beamed, as though gifting his students with a great joy. Mr. Stenakis? A girl with blonde pigtails bounced in her seat. Yes, Athena. Can we draw our brothers and sisters? Can we include our pets? Absolutely. Anyone who you consider to be part of your family can be included in your pictures. An excited buzz spread around the room, but the boy felt himself worry. He didn't like thinking about his family. He didn't even know if he had a real family. He had got used to living with the old couple, but he knew they weren't his mum and dad, and he definitely didn't have brothers or sisters, or a pet. Who could he draw? Closing his eyes, the boy tried remembering his mum, but all he could remember was that she was dead. He remembered she was dead, because he remembered the smell when she died. Here you go. Mr. Stenakis was walking around the room, handing out coloured pieces of paper. The other boys were choosing purple and blue sheets, but by the time the teacher got to him, there were only pink papers left. Ha ha! You got pink because you're a girl! Scott yelled loudly. The boy felt his cheeks flush. Putting his head down, he stared at his pink sheet of paper. What could he draw? He looked up to the blackboard for inspiration. In every picture the teacher had posted, there was always a mum and a dad with either one or two children. And they were all laughing. Not crying, or hiding, or yelling at the awful men who came past. I'm going to draw my dad taking me to a football game, a girl in the second row proudly declared. The boy thought about this. Had he ever even had a dad? He didn't think so. He certainly hadn't been taken to a football game. After staring at his page a while longer, he decided he'd start by drawing the seaside. That was his home. The beach had only been a short walk from the small flat where he'd lived with his mum, and it was their happy place. When they were at the beach, it was like they had no cares in the world. It was just the two of them, playing, splashing, and sleeping in the sun, and he could vividly remember the feeling of trotting home together, sandy but happy. Picking up a blue pencil, the boy started by drawing the waves, crashing down towards the sand. Then he drew the rickety old wooden pier where he and his mum would sometimes walk, and the bright coloured towels that would be lined up next to each other. As he looked at his picture, a terrible aching started in his chest. He missed the rush of dipping his toes in the cold water, the spike of seashells under his feet, and, most of all, of feeling his mum's hand squeeze his as they leapt over the crashing waves. He gulped as a big fat tear rolled down his cheek. He quickly wiped it away, terrified that Scott and his friends might have seen. Okay, only a few minutes to go, Mr. Stenakis called from the front of the room. The boy looked at his drawing of the beach in panic. He was nowhere near finished. Grabbing another pencil, he hurriedly continued, remembering the seagulls that would fly overhead, the sandbank that would sometimes appear out in the middle of the waves, and the mushy green seaweed that would dance at the water's edge. For another few minutes, the boy allowed himself to just draw and draw, enjoying the feeling of being back there on St. Kilda Beach, he and his mum together again. He got so lost in his memories that he didn't even notice the wetness in his lap. It was only when Gracie, The girl who was next to him screamed that the boy looked down and realised what had happened.
Mr. Stanakis, something smells funny.
Gracie pinched her nose dramatically. The room erupted into laughter and jeers as Mr. Stanakis walked the boy, his pants dripping with urine, out of the room. By the time he was cleaned up and wearing an oversized pair of emergency pants, the other children were outside playing, already well into their lunch break. The boy crept back into the classroom. The mess was gone, but a bucket, sponge, and pair of rubber gloves sat at the front of the room, and the boy squirmed as he imagined the teacher wiping his chair, where pee had trickled down onto the floor, creating dark stains on the carpet. He went over to his desk and picked up his unusual seaside drawing. His eyes welled as he looked at the angular woman he'd drawn, lying asleep on her back, the spiky needle that was sticking out of her arm, and the small child that was drawn huddled nearby, with little blue tears spilling down its cheeks. He bit his lower lip. His drawing was so different to the others. No wonder his classmates picked on him. He pressed his picture close to his face, kissing the spiky image of his mum, before scrunching the paper up into a tight ball and lobbing it into a nearby bin. Then he marched defiantly out the door. He was sick of being different. He would not be sharing his special memories with anyone ever again.